Hello everyone, and welcome back to Quellyard. In this video, we're going to explore 3 deeply unsettling unsolved disappearances. In the final story, you may think you understand what's happening, but a shocking discovery at the end completely alters everything, and it's truly chilling. Viewer discretion is advised. On the evening of March 31st, 2006, 27-year-old Brian and his father, Randy, were sitting at a table inside an Outback Steakhouse in Columbus, Ohio. Brian was a dedicated student navigating his way through medical school, and earlier that day, he had attended his last class before spring break officially began. He and his longtime girlfriend, Alexis, had plane tickets lined up for a trip to Miami, and they were both excited about the getaway. Brian had even hinted at the possibility of proposing, but amidst the excitement, the father and son could only focus on one topic. 3 weeks prior, Randy's wife and Brian's mother, Renee, had tragically passed away after battling cancer. The family was very close-knit, and along with Brian's brother, Derek, they maintained that bond despite Brian's demanding medical studies. Staying close to family was one of the main reasons Brian chose to attend Ohio State University. His future plans were a source of pride for his parents, who looked forward to the next chapter of their lives, hoping it would include grandchildren someday. It's tragic how quickly circumstances can change, turning hopeful expectations into concerns over dinner. After their meal, Brian and Randy shared a long hug in the parking lot before heading their separate ways. It was a cathartic moment for both, and that night, Brian felt the need to unwind. At around 9 p.m., he called Alexis to check in and let her know that he and his friend Clint were planning to go bar hopping. Given Brian's distress following his mother's death, Alexis was relieved to hear he wanted to enjoy himself. She wished him a fun and safe night. The two friends began their night, moving from bar to bar, stopping for a shot at each one. Shortly after midnight on April 1st, Brian and Clint ran into a mutual friend, Meredith, at a bar, and the trio decided to conclude their night at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a venue that offered food by day and live music by night. They arrived at 1:15 a.m., just in time before last call, and after sharing a drink, Brian got separated from them. He was last seen outside the Ugly Tuna at 1:55 a.m., saying goodbye to 2 women before re-entering the saloon. Minutes after he went back inside, Clint and Meredith waited for him outside, but Brian never returned. After some time, they assumed he had either walked back or found another ride, so they parted ways. This was the last confirmed sighting of Brian, and it didn't take long for his loved ones to realize something was wrong. On April 1st, Alexis didn't hear from Brian, which was highly unusual. Derek also tried to reach him, and initially, both he and Alexis thought he was just sleeping off his night out. They even considered the possibility that he was playing an April Fool's joke. However, as the day went on, it became evident that something was amiss. Alexis decided to go to his apartment and let herself in, only to discover that Brian hadn't returned the previous night. Increasingly anxious, she waited for him, but he never came home. April 1st ended without any word from him, and April 2nd brought no signs of life either. With plane tickets for April 3rd and a trip they had been eagerly anticipating, Brian needed to show up soon. However, that didn't happen. With friends and family growing increasingly worried, they contacted the police to report him missing. The case was assigned to the Columbus Police Department, which requested security footage from the Ugly Tuna. The tape confirmed what Clint and Meredith had recounted, but as they continued to review the footage, time passed without any sign of Brian. When the security footage ended, there was no indication of his whereabouts. Among the exits of the saloon, only one was not monitored by a camera, a back door used by musicians for loading equipment. Exiting through that door would have placed Brian in a construction area. Despite the absence of a camera at that exit, other bars had cameras that should have captured him if he had left that way, yet he was never seen again after re-entering the Ugly Tuna. When Brian went out of the camera's view that night, it was as if he had vanished into thin air. The investigation involved hundreds of interviews with witnesses and those close to him. Police scrutinized the video from his night out, but they kept hitting dead ends. They monitored Brian's cell phone, bank account, and credit card for any activity, but nothing surfaced. Based on the information they gathered, authorities narrowed down the possibilities of what might have happened to Brian to 3 theories. He walked away to start a new life, he left the bar with the intent to end things, or he fell victim to foul play. Each of these theories had its own complications. The family was in emotional turmoil, and during their dinner on March 31st, Brian assured Randy that he would be all right. While this didn't rule out the possibility of him wanting to escape his stressful life, his case began to gain national attention as days went by. Reported sightings came in from far and wide, even as distant as Sweden, but each sighting was either unconfirmed or turned out to be someone else. Next, considering Brian's emotional state at the time, it was plausible he could have chosen to end his life rather than start anew. However, nothing in his behavior suggested he was struggling beyond the usual grief of losing a loved one. Still, it was conceivable that Brian might have slipped away from the saloon, possibly blocked from the cameras by another patron, and gone somewhere to do something drastic. Police conducted a thorough search of the building, the sewer system, and nearby waterways, but nothing was found. This led authorities to dismiss the possibility of Brian having taken his own life, although discussions with Alexis revealed some intriguing occurrences in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. Shortly after his mother's funeral, Brian had approached Alexis in distress, asking her to run away with him. Just days before he vanished, he suggested she find someone else, feeling he was struggling too much with his grief. Although she didn't heed either suggestion, these conversations provided insight into his emotional state. Ultimately, investigators turned their focus to foul play, though this seemed the least likely scenario. The police interviewed everyone who had crossed paths with Brian that day. Clint, who had been with him from 9 p.m. until around 1:30 a.m., was a significant witness and initially cooperated with authorities. However, when asked to take a polygraph test, he abruptly hired a lawyer who advised him to refrain from further discussions with the police. Even after 18 years, Derek found it puzzling that Clint, supposedly one of Brian's best friends, might have withheld information. However, in examining the timeline supported by security footage, there seemed to be little opportunity for Clint to have committed any wrongdoing, let alone harm Brian and dispose of his body. Only 5 minutes elapsed between Brian re-entering the saloon and Clint and Meredith waiting for him outside. Since Clint stopped providing information, there remains a gap from 9 p.m. on March 31st to the early hours of April 1st when Brian and Clint were alone, an enigmatic period. It's possible that during their bar hopping, Brian confided in Clint about his desire to escape and made him promise to keep it a secret. Following his disappearance, Derek and Alexis spent an entire year calling Brian's phone daily, hoping for an answer, but every call went to voicemail. Then, 6 months after Brian vanished, during one of their attempts to reach him, the phone rang before going to voicemail, pinging off a cell tower near Hilliard, a suburb of Columbus. This lead was investigated, but it yielded no results. Tragically, the family's ordeal didn't end with Brian's disappearance. No one searched for Brian more diligently than his father, who dedicated every day for 2 years to putting up flyers and keeping his son's image in the public eye. During this time, it's unclear what he was doing, but he was struck by a falling tree limb during a windstorm and killed instantly. This meant Derek lost his mother, father, and brother all within a little over 2 years, leaving the fate of Brian that night still a mystery. As for Tom Messick, at 82, his life had been full of experiences. Though not physically imposing at 5 feet 10 inches and 160 pounds, his past as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division of the U.S. Army was evident. Tom had lost an eye and half his hearing in an explosion that also mangled one of his hands, requiring 159 stitches. While this could have defined many lives, Tom's was about survival, and he continued to thrive. An avid outdoorsman and hunter, Tom taught survival skills in Troy, New York. In 2015, after recovering from shingles, he was preparing for his annual hunting trip with friends and family. Though facing some heart issues and mobility challenges due to age, Tom decided to go on the trip, not wanting to miss out. On November 15th, he joined 6 others for a hunt at Lily Pond near Brant Lake. Around 10 a.m., Tom and several older members of the group were positioned by the younger men. Tom settled on an old tree stump, unable to pursue deer himself. The others went to drive deer toward him, but after about an hour, they returned without having seen any. By then, Tom had vanished. Initially thinking he went to relieve himself, the group called his name, but received no response. Given his deafness in one ear, they considered that he may not have heard them, but his limited mobility suggested he should have been within earshot. Hours later, as 4:30 p.m. approached without any sign of him, they reported him missing to the police. Half the group returned to the cabin, while the others shot rifles and honked car horns in hopes of guiding Tom back. The search was suspended around midnight, but a renewed effort began the next day, involving 13 different search and rescue agencies. This would become one of the most extensive searches in Adirondack history. Locals initially thought a celebrity was missing due to the high level of activity in the area. Search teams utilized helicopters with heat-detecting cameras, dogs, and a meticulous grid system, but nothing was discovered. Compounding the challenges were the conditions in November, with the forest floor covered in about 8 inches of fallen leaves. In summer, Tom might have left footprints, but the thick layer of leaves obscured any trace. Adding to the difficulties was heavy rain that moved in and lingered for several days. In 2008, Lost Person Behavior was published, a guide by behaviorist Robert Kester that revolutionized search planning based on scientific studies. One critical factor identified was timing. The first 24 hours are crucial, as the chances of finding a missing person alive decrease significantly after the second day, especially for someone of Tom's age. The book also detailed the irrational decisions people often make when lost, especially when overwhelmed by anxiety. In planning Tom's search, team leaders employed mathematical probability models and Bayesian search theory, which quantifies variables to assess the likelihood of various scenarios. This method allowed search teams to create detailed probability maps indicating where a missing person might be found. Despite the methodical approach, the search continued daily until January 2016, leaving experienced rescue members baffled, as not a single piece of evidence connected to Tom had been discovered. Meanwhile, state and federal agencies, including the FBI, collaborated to assess the possibility of foul play. Initially, investigators found no reason to suspect abduction or murder, but an interview with Tom's wife, Beverly, raised concerns. She didn't believe Tom had simply gotten lost. The outdoorsman she knew would have known how to survive. Some family members speculated that Tom had wandered off or suffered a medical emergency. The area where he disappeared was home to caves, crevices, and old abandoned mines that could easily have concealed him. As in many similar cases, theories of alien abduction emerged. One of Tom's hunting friends reported hearing an unusual noise near his location on the day Tom vanished, a sound he couldn't even describe. There were other strange circumstances too, though it's hard to discern whether these were misinterpretations or genuine anomalies. One major concern among the searchers was the complete lack of wildlife in the woods that day. Not only did they not see any animals, but there was an eerie silence, leading some to speculate that something was keeping the wildlife away. As of 2024, the search for Tom continues, albeit on a much smaller scale, with no trace of him ever found. On March 26, 1991, South Korea experienced a historic moment with the reinstatement of local elections after 30 years, granting cities and towns a level of autonomy previously lost. This was a chance for South Koreans to participate in their communities, electing council members and mayors after decades of military rule. The day was marked as a national holiday, allowing citizens to exercise their right to vote, and media coverage was extensive. However, while much of the country focused on the elections, 5 boys aged 9 to 13 living in a village near Daegu had other plans on their rare school-free Tuesday. Fascinated by wildlife, they set out to search for frogs and salamanders. Around 9 a.m., John Yu's son, Cheol-won, rushed into their home, grabbed a thicker coat, and dashed out the door. When John Yu asked where he was going, Cheol-won didn't respond, either too eager to catch frogs or fearing he might ruin his plans. Had he answered, it might have prevented one of South Korea's most shocking and enduring mysteries. Hours later, around 1 p.m., John Yu received a call from Cheol-won's taekwondo instructor reporting his absence from class. This raised alarms for John Yu, as his son was responsible and wouldn't skip a lesson without a good reason. Thankfully, the 5 boys were close friends, having grown up together in a village where their houses formed a circle around a field. John Yu quickly began checking on the other boys, but soon realized none of their parents knew where they had gone either. Each boy had been somewhat secretive about their plans, heightening the concern. The parents knew the boys often hung out at Mount Woryong, so that's where the search began. While hiking up the mountain, John Yu encountered a friend who had seen the boys earlier. They had mentioned their plans to look for frogs and salamanders, confirming that the mountain was the right place to search. However, after checking their usual spots without success, the parents decided to call the police to report the boys missing. The police response was somewhat dismissive, treating the boys as runaways who would eventually return if the parents waited. This only increased tension among the families, leading to blame shifting for not keeping a closer watch on the boys. As the afternoon turned to evening, reporters caught wind of the story, but many outlets were more focused on the landmark elections. The parents sought coverage from newspapers and TV stations in vain, receiving the same response from the police, to be patient and wait for the boys to turn up. Days passed without any public mention of the boys' disappearance, but by the 1-week mark after the elections, the case gained national attention. The public became captivated, and a popular news program, Square of Public Opinion, invited the parents as guests. At that point, the police were still dragging their feet on the investigation, which the parents made clear during interviews. During a live broadcast, a sobbing voice suddenly came through the phone calls from the audience. Shocked, both the studio audience and viewers at home listened as the call abruptly cut off. A telephone operator claimed it was one of the missing boys, pleading for his mother, which ignited cheers in the studio. This seemed to confirm that the boys were still alive, providing a glimmer of hope. However, it was later revealed that the call was a prank, and the search returned to square one. Despite this setback, the show caught the attention of the South Korean president, who announced a commitment of 300,000 police officers to a nationwide search, along with establishing a special investigation headquarters. Searches were conducted in waterways, reservoirs, and bus stations throughout the country, and a reward of approximately $35,000 was offered for information leading to the boys. Over the following year, thousands of volunteers participated in more than 500 organized searches of Mount Woryong. Unfortunately, none of these efforts yielded results. During this time, all 5 fathers quit their jobs to focus on finding their sons. They pooled their resources to rent a small truck, which they adorned with large signs displaying images of the 5 boys. They traveled from villages to towns to cities, handing out flyers in search of any tips that might lead to the boys. This exhaustive journey, however, proved fruitless, and as days turned into months, the emotional toll began to weigh heavily on the fathers. One father became so haunted by dreams of his son that he developed an addiction to sleeping pills. Others turned to alcohol, and the mounting debt from their travels forced them to abandon their daily searches and return to work. 2 years after returning to their jobs and 5 years after their sons disappeared, the fathers were slowly reestablishing their lives. Though they had little choice but to move forward, their sons remained in their thoughts. During this period, a criminal psychologist investigating the case presented a troubling theory. He believed one of the boys' fathers had killed them all and buried them in his basement. At the time, there were few criminal psychologists in South Korea, and this one, having studied in the U.S., garnered public credibility. His accusations prompted police to conduct a search of the father's home, including excavating the basement. Media coverage was extensive, with cameras allowed into the basement to document the dig. However, when the entire basement was essentially destroyed without any bodies being found, the psychologist rushed to the scene, pushing through the crowd outside. When it became clear that his allegations were unfounded, an angry mob chased him, and he had to be taken to the police station for his safety. Tragically, 5 years later, that same father succumbed to liver cancer at age 49, a condition believed to have been worsened by the stress of his son's disappearance and the psychologist's claims. As another year passed, the story faded from the media spotlight, but the remaining fathers continued their efforts, approaching newspapers and TV stations in the capital, pleading for coverage of the case, only to be turned away each time. A year after the death of that father, and 11 years after the boys went missing, 2 men gathering acorns on Mount Woryong stumbled upon skeletal remains protruding from the ground. These bones belonged to the 5 boys, later known as the Frog Boys. Police arrived promptly, but the street officers lacked the expertise to excavate remains properly, leading to potential contamination of the evidence. Rather than preserving the bones together, they mixed them up, sorting skulls with skulls, femurs with femurs. By the time forensic scientists arrived 2 hours after the initial call, the police had completely confused the remains, making it impossible to identify which bones belonged to which boy. The next day, authorities held a press conference, speculating that the likely cause of death was hypothermia. The day the boys disappeared was already cold and wet. And as night fell, the temperature dropped to 3 degrees Celsius, or about 37 degrees Fahrenheit. These harsh conditions would have almost certainly led to hypothermia. Initially, the way the bodies were found, huddled together with one boy's clothing tied in a bundle, was interpreted as evidence that they sought warmth from one another. However, when the clothing was untangled, live bullets and empty cartridges spilled out, raising alarming questions. A closer examination of the skulls revealed that 3 of the 5 boys showed signs of blunt force trauma, likely inflicted by some kind of metal object, suggesting possible foul play. This discovery was further complicated by the fact that the bodies were located less than 2 kilometers from their homes, in an area they were familiar with. Many began to doubt the likelihood that they had simply gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. In the wake of these revelations, theories and rumors began to circulate. Authorities considered the possibility of a serial killer, but no similar crime scenes had been identified before or after the boys' disappearance. The most compelling theory pointed to a site near the top of Mount Woryong, which housed a South Korean army base, complete with a shooting range. On the day of the boys' disappearance, there were no military drills due to the national holiday for elections, allowing commissioned officers to shoot freely at the range. The boys' bodies were found just 100 to 200 meters downrange, well within the effective range of the rifles used there. Reports surfaced that at least one officer had visited the range to fire off some extra ammunition that day, although the identity of that officer was never established. Some parents speculated that the boys might have been killed to cover up an accidental shooting, but this theory remained unconfirmed. What was certain, however, was that the bullets found among the boys' clothing were traced back to the army base. Despite this, neither the police nor the government conducted a thorough investigation into the military personnel stationed there. In the years that followed, the parents collectively filed 3 lawsuits against the police for negligence in their investigation, but they lost each case. After several years in a lab, the boys' remains were finally returned to their families for proper burial. Due to the mixing of the remains, they were cremated together. In life and death, the boys remained united, while the mystery of their fate continued to haunt their families. As the years passed, the case faded from the media spotlight, but the parents never stopped seeking answers. They continued to advocate for their sons, sharing their story in hopes of keeping the memory alive. The unresolved tragedy left a mark on the community, reminding everyone of the fragility of life and the importance of vigilance. So, what do you think happened in each of these stories? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. If you have any story suggestions, don't hesitate to submit them through the form in the description. I hope to see you in the next video.